It is strange how little we remember of paradise. But over the centuries, the painters have tried to help refresh our memories of Eden. Sometimes, in their images of delight, we experience a flash of recognition, like something known at the edge of a dream. And one tradition endures, stubbornly anchored in theology and myth. There was a primal language, an Adamic tongue. No one knows which language Adam and Eve spoke, but early belief was unanimous in saying that the language of Eden had two absolutely essential distinctive aspects. First, it was a language of perfect transparency, of absolute truth. When Adam gave names to the animals in the garden, each name totally defined and expressed the living being to which it was given. It was this perfect translucency, the light passing through every syllable, which made it possible for God to share a common discourse with Adam and Eve, which enabled Adam and Eve to understand God directly. Secondly, the language of the garden was one in which man and animal could communicate with each other. Speech was not a barrier between man and organic nature, but a living bond. Hence the profoundly attentive birds and beasts, lambs and lions, with which the painters surround Adam and Eve in the harmonious gossip of the garden. Somehow the primal language of Eden continued to be spoken during the early generations of man's life and toil. Then came the catastrophe at Babel. We know it was a catastrophe, a new darkness on the earth. But we do not really know what the legend is trying to tell us. Were men trying to build a great tower near Babylon in order to honor their deities and search out the astronomy of the heavens? And did the one and only God take offense, shattering the proud ziggurat at a blow? Or was there, as that somber spinner of fables, Franz Kafka, suggests, a hideous misunderstanding? Were men actually trying to erect an edifice so lofty that they could, from its final terrace, make the Creator listen to their prayers and heed their plight? We don't know, but the outcome was clear and of overwhelming terror. The people of the earth, who had come together in common labor, broke apart in a sudden confusion of mutually incomprehensible tongues. And when they cried out in their need, no passing stranger from any other tongue, no animal could understand them.
وعند الرجال اللي ما يستاهلون غير علمهم طيب وغان
दूसरे के पास भी देते हैं, अपने दादा दादी के पास भी जाते हैं.
Sendiri hayatım nubin milli kanga melin bayatım mana kanga reng panorum mana.
Kair bada anwarna bada bada.
De taal van een volk is altijd belangrijk voor een volk. Het is de identiteit zelf van een volk.
Kuyeya no murume nkamadine kudima. Murume ne kuyeyanga okukura no sikuru.
Each and every one of us has, at some point in his life, experienced the shock of finding himself suddenly trapped in a prison house of language. The occasion can be trivial. We arrive in Warsaw, our clothes rumpled, and find ourselves blankly, maddeningly incapable of asking for a coat hanger. We don't know how to ask for a bit of ice to cool the tepid mineral water in a Greek taverna. we're unable to find an edible dish on the foreign language menu. A sudden wall of blankness, infantile gesture, or sheer silence cuts us off from our fellow man. Often the effect is visual. We walk down a street in Athens or Budapest, and the shop signs, billboards, street signs stare at us with a mute grimace. Where the visual and the auditive alienness, the loud and the graphic impenetrability come together, exasperation, impatience can darken to a subtle uneasiness and finally to panic. Unable to make sense of the letters swarming at us from walls, newspaper stands, or flashing neon, unable to seize meaning from the clamorous rout of spoken sounds all around us, we feel coming over us the ancient terror of the moment of fracture at Babel. Why do all these people not speak my language? Why am I caught up in this conspiracy of non-meaning? The nightmare wings of an old science fiction scene brush past us, to awake in a world in which no one anywhere can understand a word of what we're saying. The mythical hammer blow at Babel shivered the world's languages into thousands of fragments. How many thousands? Surprisingly enough, we don't know. Even our most sophisticated guesses are very approximate. And I say guesses because no one, whether he's a linguist or a layman, has any very good estimate of how many languages are spoken by man on this earth. I'm here in the library of the British and Foreign Bible Society in London. This library contains Bibles in nearly 2,000 different languages, ranging all the way from Abu, a language of New Guinea, to Zulu. And even this tremendous selection does not represent anything like the total of languages spoken on this earth. And these translations are meant for entirely different groups of people in number and kind. Here, for example, is the first edition of our own authorized version, the King James Bible, which has shaped the English and American languages and the lives of millions of English speakers all over the earth. And here is part of the Bible translated into Kuku Yalanji, a language spoken by perhaps 100 Aborigines in northeastern Australia.
목이 마릅니다. 물을 마시고 싶습니다.
Kam etje, duauie.
我渴了，我要喝水。
Nina kiu, nataka maji.
मैं प्यासा हूँ, मुझे पानी चाहिए.
I am thirsty. I need water.
목이 마릅니다.
A very simple sentence. I am thirsty. I need water. We've heard it said in 6 languages. The thirst is the same and the need. But if we listen closely, or have these different sentences spelled out for us, we see at once how much they differ. In the sound pattern, in the number of syllables uttered, in the grammatical relations between them.
목이 마릅니다. 물을 마시고 싶습니다.
Kam etje, duauie.
我渴了，我要喝水。
Nina kiu, nataka maji.
मैं प्यासा हूँ, मुझे पानी चाहिए.
I am thirsty. I need water.
If we put together what we know about the languages of the past and about those in current usage, we get to the really fantastic figure of something between 8 and 10,000 human tongues in use after Babel. Take Brittany, on the northwest tip of France, where the ancient Breton language is still spoken in quiet, forgotten villages. Here, for a few, despite the economic miracle, despite television, radio, and all the pressures of the 20th century, Breton is still the language you buy your butter in. Or go to the south of France, in the Pyrenees. Here the Basque communities on the French side speak their ancient, enigmatic speech, surrounded on all sides by French speakers. On the other side of the mountains, Basque is still spoken, but surrounded by Catalan and Spanish.
A, I, ta. O, na, da, gu.
In southern Switzerland, less than 50,000 people cling to their language.
Vă cerin ots cu una nova lezione, quella lezione gisiat. Nus vengi sti figli avom nus, elegin in agadi zur script regula.
La lavina.
Legi a una construzione.
Il ei in bellezia cit un vien.
It's called Romanche, and some scholars claim that it is a direct survival of the Latin spoken by the Roman legions stationed in these alpine valleys centuries ago. But probably there is no place in Europe today where the language situation is more sharply divided and more graphic than Belgium. If you are Flemish, that is Dutch-speaking, this is Leuven. But if you are a Walloon or French-speaking, you identify yourself as a citizen of Louvain. The division between the two language groups is deep and savage. Leuven is in the northern Flemish part of Belgium. The language, the culture are Dutch. But a mile from Leuven, you can cross a frontier that is invisible but as potent as barbed wire. You could be in France. But it is in Brussels, capital of Belgium, and the heart of the new United Europe, that the divisions are most extraordinary. The suburbs themselves are divided, some French, some Flemish, some mixed. The constant shift of commuters and workers changes the delicate balance between the languages almost by the hour. Only the most extreme policy of linguistic apartheid and reduplication, each and every public text having to be in French and Flemish, has prevented the country splitting in half. But for the moment, prosperity welds the two sides of the nation together. Thus, when we try to grasp this Babel after Babel, we arrive at a first baffling realization. In some cases, language lines cut right across shared landscapes, common economic and social structures, a joint history and racial identity. But in other cases, the use of different languages does relate to other great differences between races, climates, social systems. The great jigsaw puzzle of the World Language Atlas seems to have neither a natural nor a logical pattern.
हम अब
अपने दिल से ये चाहते हैं जी कि एक आधा लड़का तो कहीं बाहर भी जावे और ये क्या नाम लिखा है पढ़ाना भी अच्छी तरह से.
But human beings do not only speak several thousand different languages. Some of them use special vocalic means with which to produce and communicate articulate sounds. There are so-called click languages of Africa, as here in the Kalahari, in which speech sounds are produced by drumming the tongue against the palate. These people have also perfected a method of communication when hunting, and total silence is required. Among the Creek Indians of Louisiana, the men used to speak differently from the women. Alas, no record of this speech remains. There was a male idiom and a female idiom, each with its own grammatical features and words. Anthropologists and linguists believe that such a division into man talk and woman talk may have been widespread in many early cultures. And to make male chauvinism worse, the women had to know man talk in order to teach it to their sons. The Creek Indians would have been the final practitioners of division, deeply entrenched in human usage. Every act of speech is embedded in a live context of facial expression, bodily heave and twist, motions of shoulder and hand, stance or mutual approach and retreat between speaker and hearer. In this wonderfully rich context, which can underline, qualify, subvert, or even negate the words which our mouth is uttering, differs from language to language, from social class to social class, from region to region. Just look at Fernandel speaking his vintage version of Southern French, and watch his expression, which becomes so profoundly equine that there can be no possible misunderstanding with his beloved horse.
Garçon! Un 50e pour moi et un seau d'eau pour monsieur.
Minéral?
Non, naturel. Avec une petite goutte de grenadine. Il adore le doux. Hein?
Hello there, Zebra. Are you all right? I don't think so, leader. Stand by.
Now look at a moment of thundering bad news in a British hero film like The Dam Buster.
Gone as that, Zebra.
That leaves two more.
Kirkasa?
The lips remain thin, the backs ramrod stiff, the arms unmoving. And now, in wild contrast, the body and hand ballet of two Yiddish speakers on 47th Street, the Diamond Market in Manhattan. Watch the weaving choreography of their exchange, the swift current of signals from toe to fingertip, which surrounds, accompanies, possibly contradicts what they're in fact saying to each other. From a language dance of this kind, it is only a short, natural step to the actual hand alphabet of the deaf. Thus, as they scattered from the black winds and falling masonry at Babel, the men and women of the earth took on thousands of different language skins. And they dwell inside them to this day, often in painful mutual incomprehension and exasperation. Because we live inside it, this Babel after Babel, this great confusion of tongues, seems to us entirely natural and inevitable. It is only when we stop to think of it, this myriad pandemonium of the world's racing tongues, that a sense of wonder and perhaps of panic overcomes us.
আমার অন্তরে যদি উদ্বেলিত হতো এই কামনায়
L'ingaliuesa cuticchista dunia.
Ρημάτε στην Ελλάδα, πηγαίνετε
Suppose it were different. Suppose that all men on this little planet spoke only one language, one great tongue with some local variations. Let us get help from that old friend of philosophic arguments, the open-minded visitor from Mars. He's hovering at some distance above the Earth. From his observation, he would soon realize that people are, in vital, essential respects, measurements and needs, pretty much the same the whole world over. They have the same physiology, the same nervous system, the same brain dimensions. Their ways of eating, their sexual behavior, their decay and death are essentially the same. They need exactly the same mixture of oxygen and nitrogen in order to live, and precisely the same, often minute amount of a poisonous substance will kill them wherever they are. If he was able to make out the fact of human speech, our visitor would be confident that men and women speak the same language, that there is a human tongue as there is a human way of walking or sleeping. But if our Martian looks a little more closely, he will notice that there are indeed some very interesting differences dividing the human species. He would make out the great ethnic groupings. His lens would register the differences between the half-dozen skin colors. He would see that the inhabitants of this earth seem to be built according to two principal bone structures. Pondering this, the Martian might revise his first hypothesis and speculate that humanity did not speak one single tongue, but rather 5 or 6 great languages. Circling the Earth from his satellite, seeing how neatly Latin America fits into the great western indentation of Africa, the Martian could quite easily arrive at the idea of continental drift and ethnic diffusion. In some remote past, the continents had formed a single landmass. Now they've drifted apart to make up 5 independent bodies. What could be more reasonable, more in harmony with all the other great yardsticks of human difference, than to suppose that the human species speaks half a dozen ultimately related tongues? Nothing could have prepared our Martian for what he hears when he actually switches on his microphones and listens.
Distinguished delegates, in addressing you as the national of Sri Lanka, I should like to stress the implications of and the benefits we derive from our association with the widest possible cross-section of nations in several and distinctive groupings. Geographically, we belong to the
en distintas agrupaciones varias. Geográficamente pertenecemos al grupo asiático.
Древнюю историю и культуру, которые
كثيرة في آسيا نشارك التراث الذي لا يقدر.
有一个古老的文化，有丰富。
Et aux épreuves actuelles. Nous continuons de faire partie du groupe des pays du Commonwealth, qu'on appelait autrefois le Commonwealth britannique, et c'est pour nous la possibilité de nous concerter dans le cadre d'une institution unique qui, de par sa nature, est un...
It's important to make an
الشعبية وأسرة
家属，我们表示我们最诚挚的同情。
Перед вами в качестве гражданина Шри-Ланка я хотел бы подчеркнуть то значение.
跟联邦国家集团。
Aurait le nouvel ordre économique.
مواقف المتصارعة.
Whether it be international or regional.
Point de vue.
在一
Форумом.
Actitudes.
Su quota responsabilidad. In the course of the general debate.
What explanation could there possibly be for this crazy quilt? How could this fantastic tohu bohu, the suggestive biblical word for chaos, ever have come about? For reasons which may be connected with a strong human desire for unity in a world threatened by nuclear extinction, this question is rarely asked. It is not the lunatic prodigality of different human languages which interests modern linguists. It is the possibility that certain very basic uniformities, called deep structures, in fact underlie all past, present, and conceivable modes of human utterance. They are concerned with universals. The chief exponent of this is the great American linguist, Professor Noam Chomsky, of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Chomsky is very much the philosopher, thinking about the phenomenon of language from a distance. But more and more linguists and anthropologists nowadays go out into the field with notebooks and tape recorders to find out for themselves about the turbulent and utterly bewitching mess of human tongues.
How about other domestic animals?
The correct name for dog is Nechien.
Nishlia. That has something horse in the middle of it, doesn't it?
No, that horse is taken from the word dog.
I see.
And Nechien in the old language means it has something to do with a beast of burden.
Shikuri, shikha. In our language we say shitsi.
These linguists observe something much more mysterious in language than Chomsky would seem to admit. They cannot fail to notice that social and historical forces shape and adapt languages, whatever underlying universal principles may exist.
In our language we say,
one such linguist anthropologist, Del Hymes, has said, most language begins where abstract universals leave off. The more one emphasizes universals, the more mysterious actual language becomes. We conduct our lives in the midst of an utterly bewildering welter of languages.
I will add this. The United Kingdom will gladly allow any form of inspection and control that is accepted by the Soviet Union. A large number... Well, I'd like it translated if you was...
The Universalist school does not wish to touch on the Babel-ridden. It finds the speculations on the matter, which have been produced by philosophers and poets, to be silly or futile. Perhaps so. But as Del Hymes said, Chinookan is not Sahaptin, is not Klamath, is not Tekelma, is not Kuth, is not English, is not French, is not Arabic. A view of language which has nothing to say about the central role which this fact plays in the condition of mankind seems to me utterly inadequate. Why did human evolution produce this babble? How did it come about? Let us look at Charles Darwin and his majestic account of evolution. You will remember how Darwin came to understand and justify the fantastic variety of living species, the seemingly uncontrolled and apparently wasteful way in which nature has brought into being hundreds of thousands of different forms of insect, plant, and animal life. Like these specimens held at London's Linnean Society, the society to which he first unfolded his majestic theory of evolution.
The way Darwin explains the fantastic proliferation of species is by saying every single living form has a highly unique and specialized function in the total web of life. It's a matter of the right fit. Each species, each genus of plant or living animal fits exactly and fits in one way only into the jigsaw puzzle of life. Thus, for example, there is an insect, and one only, which drops its eggs in the eyes of one species of fish, where the eggs hatch into larvae and trigger a unique chemical reaction which cleans, lubricates the eyes of the host. In short, far from being wasteful, the immense multiplication of natural living species is a piece of miraculous economy. Each species, like for example these plants which Linnaeus gathered 250 years ago, has survived a competitive struggle of exquisite and ever more exact adjustment to its surroundings. I wonder whether we could think of our language problem in this way. Could it be that every one of the thousands of different languages being spoken on this earth fits exactly in its social and geographical environment, and would fit as well in no other spot? I've brought to the Linnean Society a jigsaw puzzle map. What it shows is Nigeria in Africa, and each colored area stands for a different language group. Let's be careful here, because in a language group, there are many, many single languages, some of them perhaps as far apart as French and German in the European group. And Nigeria, which is about as large as France and Germany combined, has in it, according to the best current estimates, about 400 entirely distinct languages. Let's look at this jigsaw puzzle map in the light of Darwin's hypothesis. Could it be, for example, that the 50 or more distinct languages which are spoken down here in southern Nigeria along the Cross River are such that each one of them fits and fits exactly and uniquely into the surrounding setting, climate, and conditions? So that, for example, the Korop language, this jigsaw piece here, which is spoken by a small group of peoples in the hills west of Mount Cameroon, is perfectly adapted to the tropical rainforest in which its speakers live. Whereas, if we move right up to the northern top of our map, we find the Ngisi language being spoken in a semi-desert, very arid, and much hotter climate and surrounding. And we could say that the Ngisi piece wouldn't fit at all into that slot in our puzzle in which the Korop language is spoken.
It's an attractive idea, but it just doesn't work. For one thing, any human tongue can represent, cope with every environment. It is perfectly true that Eskimo languages have developed some 20 different expressions to characterize different textures of snow and ice. And it is equally the case that the gauchos, the cattlemen of Argentina, use more than 30 distinct terms with which to discriminate between the shadings of cattle hides. In both cases, we have a clear adaptive advantage to the conditions of material survival in a given environment. But any other language, if brought to the Pampas or the Arctic, can cope just as well and produce whatever special terms it needs. In other words, we're dealing with technical conveniences which have been evolved historically and towards deliberate ends. We are not dealing with a biological mutation as Darwin would have understood it. Bible translators work with some 2,000 human tongues. How do they translate words like sand into Eskimo or snow into Congolese? Eugene Nida is one of the world's foremost translators of the Bible.
Well, sand is not very much of a problem because sand exists almost all over the world. So we're not too worried. Even in Amazonia, you've got sand along the riverbanks. So that's not a difficulty. Sometimes it is a little problem to deal with something like snow because in the tropics, people just aren't aware of snow. Actually, in some areas, for example, of East Africa, they call snow volcano frost. And this is also true in some of the areas in South America, where there just is no snow at all. Normally, we would use some such expression as very, very white, because that's, after all, the real meaning of snow. And in some instances, they will even have an idiom, which to them does mean very white, such as white as egret feathers, something of that kind. But we don't use an idiom unless, of course, it's a normal idiom in the language, because otherwise you could get way off base. One poor fellow, you know, was trying to make up a word for a donkey, the type of animal that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on. So he called it a long-eared animal. But the people knew no donkeys, and so they said, this is very strange, because how could he have ridden into Jerusalem on a rabbit? This was the only long-eared animal they knew. So you have to be very careful when you're making up expressions.
French and English will, more or less perfectly, translate into one another, or into Swahili, or Hebrew, or Cantonese, or what you will.
Now let's remember the second main part of Darwin's whole theory, the survival of the fittest. Could this be just the exact analogy we've been looking for with language? In 1845, for example, a Russian traveler in Siberia found 5 individuals still speaking a tongue called Kot, or by some linguists, Kotu. Only a few short years later, there was not one speaker left. The great bulldozer of Russian, political, economic, and social, had swept that tongue into oblivion, just as in Siberia, a few thousand years earlier, the great woolly mammoths had died out, and earlier still, the saber-toothed tiger. And on the other hand, if we watch the triumphant progress of American English across the whole world today, don't we have the perfect Darwinian example of an evolutionary winner, of someone whose adjustment, economic, social, political, practical, is so good that the weaker languages are dying out in its path?
But even this theory doesn't stand up. It simply makes no sense to say that any language on Earth is better, more efficient, stronger than any other. Innumerable tongues in use among so-called primitive or materially backward cultures are grammatically more elaborate, more subtle, more exact in their discriminations between human moods and perceptions than are the great world languages which now seem so obviously successful. In the Kalahari, life can be so basic that sometimes the Bushmen are obliged to use sand and urine to ward off the fierce heat of the desert sun. That their languages have more refined verb tenses or distinctions between different kinds of if statements than were available to classical Greek and to the needs of Plato or Aristotle.
The Bushman language, this particular language of the Kalahari, or what is perhaps better, the Namibia now, is a highly sophisticated, remarkable language. It has 4 different levels of tone. It has 20 different clicks, of different types of clicks, and it has a remarkable grammatical structure. And they have a subtlety in their language about logic, which really fascinated me. You see, they have a particle, ra, which goes in two different places in a sentence like, what is this? If you put it at the beginning of the sentence, it means, identify this in terms of its class. If they put it at the end of the sentence, it means, now we know what it is, tell us what it's for. And this is a subtle distinction which is constantly confusing people in English when they say, what is this? Because you really don't know whether they're saying, classify it, or tell me what it's good for. And there are many other elements in that language which, frankly, fascinated us. You can say anything that you like in the Bushman language. Of course, you may have to borrow some words, just like English has borrowed more than 50% of its vocabulary from various sources. But it's still a very remarkably subtle form of language.
According to one famous linguist, Benjamin Lee Whorf, the language of the Hopi Indians of the American Southwest allows just the sort of description of complex states of motion and uncertain relations between cause and effect required by modern nuclear physics, but almost impossible to express in normal spoken English. The obvious fact that certain languages have not produced great literatures has nothing whatever to do with any mysterious intrinsic quality. The reasons may be those of climate, social structure, population density, historical accident, or the very powerful but non-linguistic difference between cultures which write down their myths or poems and those, far more numerous, which preserve and transmit them orally. The whole Darwinian analogy is enormously seductive and tempting. It somehow seems to feel right, but it isn't. Not in any straightforward environmental or biological sense. We don't really know how many languages there are. We don't know why there are so many. Right now we're certain of one thing only, of the chaotic babble of tongues and of their profound effect on us as individuals and as communities. Take the language of just one such community. Let's look at Brittany, where the legacy of Babel is both as pointed and ultimately perhaps as poignant as anywhere in Europe. A language can be a bond with the past, and no place in Europe has a more distinctive sense of the past than does Brittany. It has its own singular form of Catholicism, with its own legends, its own saints, who are carved in a manner unique to Brittany on ancient calvaries outside moss-covered parish churches. These saints have weird, Cornish-sounding names that suggest a past so antique as to reach back to an earlier, darker age than Christianity, to a time almost of magic. This is Carnac in South Brittany, one of the most time-haunted, time-possessed places on earth. There are thousands of these giant stones, or megaliths, set in very complicated alignments and intricate patterns, which for centuries seemed to mean nothing. Now we're beginning to hear what these stones are telling us. They speak very clearly of a kind of fantastic computer by which an ancient civilization looked at the stars. Now, we know nothing about these extraordinary people.
We don't know their name. We know nothing of what they were really trying to say in their spoken language. But these stones are a living code. They speak to us of a whole, immemorially lost and fantastic world. They speak absolutely articulately, though in silence. And across this gap of almost 6,000 years, only a code, only a language, even if it isn't out loud, can do this and can tear apart the veil of time. If stones can speak so loud across millennia of silence, just imagine what a spoken language is to the people who live in this haunting and haunted land.
Ni trakinen di gani, ni trakinen di vivi, nemet anavel vis architelli, anavel druk, anavel but, a ramsar skorn o warvin hud, en i gravan en des lazet urbern evenet, an dud no des kid goudese, a pitrar a fisideso.
Maudef Glendour is rector of Lannion on the north coast. He's not only a fervent Breton nationalist, but a poet.
O deus laket a mer da gouez an tiv, a skans, a gwerch, evite sebelian a nevenet. Nemet ur chlas, e deus tintet, a dreuzer didrouz ar zernos, ivel pa vigebete sondet.
The Breton language goes back to the 6th or 7th century AD. It has been spoken and dreamt and loved by the people who live here despite the pressures of the French language which surrounds it. Breton is a Celtic language. It was brought here by a great migration of Britons fleeing from Cornwall from Anglo-Saxon invaders in the 6th century. In Cornwall, the language has been extinct since the 18th century.
Oui, j'ai recueilli beaucoup de choses sur le folklore populaire.
And so it's not surprising that, like many in the Breton movement, Glendour is obsessed by Breton folklore, old volumes, ancient chants.
A écrit, voici par exemple une chanson sur la pauvreté. C'est une chanson du vieux folklore populaire. Squeeze on meo servigi gudus art neland kenar, am meo sonjal dimesi, a kemer ma benosar, am meo sonjal dimesi, a kemer ma benosar. A vraiment parent dime eter mi gruken zieges, mais au grand guishma russa, evit pas one me mates, mais au grand guishma russa, evit pas one me mates. Bravo hier beam matte senentia beadra, evite non e bis en mestres, nagili nanus mitra, evite non e bis en mestres, nagili nanus mitra.
Angela Duval farms a few acres inland from the coast. She lives and she works alone, and she too is a poet.
Vous nous lisez un poème?
Bon, alors ça c'est à mes petits compagnons noirs. Dan vinden je du. Kalonie veel. Schaden al na vezis vido. Nime schaden zeer garante a stage oost de westers. Wakido schaden hoen. Hiual schaden oor. Neukido schaden a vis. Neukido schaden a sclaveles. A dalek de gamido kind aan bitek de basio diwea. Hoe bidwa gazelio fido. In tu, hors, paard. A di don ragueles o ken per is un clan, caloni fiel. Naguram galoni vidon tula dita veel dios. I balena mus a held fondus, a gevoki di lees di suur. Ze zoeken de mus naar greina i teva divrik. De hoerwezen door het blin, maar juren in de ranger koers.
But there is another side to all this. A language like Breton cuts its speaker off not only from the country to which he belongs, France, but almost from the world of the 20th century. It carries within it inevitably a kind of artificial nostalgia for a legendary and independent past. It goes against the grain of technology, of the realities of commercial and scientific life in a modern world. And furthermore, there is very often behind such rebellions of linguistic minorities a strong element of political reaction, which sometimes explodes into violence. Some Bretons are prepared to fight. They fight for their language against a government in Paris that is French and thus foreign. But not only in Brittany. Linguistic divisions can breed savage hatreds everywhere in the world. They can sever neighbor from neighbor and trigger murderous violence. Some of the bitterest, least negotiable conflicts in the world today are those which set language community against language community. To those who have not witnessed them at first hand, the virulence, the implacable purpose of French-speaking Canadians, and the resulting isolation of French Canada from Ottawa and the Canadian Pacific will seem scarcely believable. But now, as we know, Quebec has voted for autonomy.
De spits van de Vlaamse beweging, te Brussel, Vlaams-Brabant, in de Voerstreek en...
Nearer home, Flemish speaker and Walloon now confront each other across a literal language barricade, so bristling with antagonism that the future of Belgium as a nation is not certain. This is Dixmude, deep in the Flemish heartland. It is a holy place to the Flemish patriot, for it is here that the most honored of their war dead lie. These Flemings were killed, as often as not, they claim, by the indifference and incapacity of their French-speaking officers as by the Germans they fought.
Strijden en lijden, denkend aan ons volk en ons recht, zweren wij eeuwig trouw aan Vlaanderen. Wij eisen zelfbestuur. Regeling, werk van duur. Weg met de voogden.
Once a year, the Flemings come here to celebrate their separateness from French-speaking Belgium, to make a ritual out of their linguistic grievances, and to look forward to achieving, by whatever means, Flemish separation, or even better, a Flemish-speaking state. In less fortunate parts of the globe, there has been havoc. The Tamil language riots, which tore across southern India in the 1950s and 60s, left many thousands dead or dying in the streets. When the South African government tried to impose the Afrikaans language on the Bantu schools, it sparked off riots and death. The myth of Babel is a tragic one, because men have felt profoundly handicapped, baffled, or threatened by the thousand-fold splintering of human tongues. This is the world after Babel. Can anything be done about it? Ought anything to be done about it?
può cominciare, dai.
Che sta
Language. It ties us together into a community of human beings. And it turns us into strangers. What can be done about this? Next week, in part 2 of The Tongues of Men, Professor Steiner shows the many ways language barriers have been overcome with mathematical languages, computer languages, the languages of empire like French or Latin, Esperanto, a modern synthetic language, and the latest way, American English. Could any of these succeed as a world language? And do we really need one? Could it help prevent human suffering and misunderstanding, even war? And would the great diversity of mankind be destroyed in the process? Watch The Tongues of Men, Part 2, next time on Nova.